Good evening, everyone. I'm Shai, co-founder of Mechon Hadar. Let me just say a couple sentences about what we're going to try to do. What we're going to do over the course of the next hour and a half is first, our guest, who I will introduce in 1 second, and I are each going to teach a text that has been important to us in thinking about questions of Torah and justice. Then we're going to conduct a conversation between us, and then we're going to open the floor for about a half hour of questions and conversations between us and all of you. It is a great personal privilege for me to welcome my friend of very long-standing, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, to Mechon Hadar. Rabbi Jacobs is the executive director of Tru'ah, the Rabbinic call for human rights. She is, as most of you no doubt know, an extremely highly regarded leader, activist, thinker. I always like to say, it's not clear that the American Jewish penchant for lists of important Jews is a good thing, but to the extent that the American Jews did it, Jill was always very high on those lists and for multiple years, which tells you something about the esteem in which she is held. And she really is one of the most sought-after voices, and for good reason, on questions of Judaism and social justice and the issues facing the Jewish community and the broader world. So really welcome and thank you for being here. In the words of Jeb Bush, please clap. Now, we're going to begin. Thank you all very much. We're going to begin, as I mentioned, with I'm going to hand the floor to you, Jill, and to share a text. You all should have a piece of paper in front of you.
Thank you, and it's really, really nice to be here. First, because Shai is a friend of, I won't say how many years, but I'm not sure we've ever taught together, so that's really special. And to be here in this institution, which he and many other people who are really important in my life have built together, it's amazing to be here. One of the first things, or really the first thing that the Torah teaches us about human beings is that all of us are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And that's a statement that we throw out all the time. I mean, just here and there we say, well, we're all b'tselem Elohim, et cetera, but we often don't talk about what that means. And it's actually an incredibly challenging question. What does it mean that we're created b'tselem Elohim? For those of us who don't believe in an anthropomorphic vision of God, it doesn't mean that God has a nose and ears and looks like us. So it means something else. And there are lots and lots of answers, but I want to bring one that I find is especially challenging and personally challenging, certainly to me, and I hope to all of us. So this is a parable that the Tosefta, an early rabbinic text, brings. And it starts with this biblical verse that says, Ki kilat Elohim talui, that a person who's hanged is a curse against God. And this is a section that says that if a person is hanged, which is one of the hanged or really crucified, which is one of the permissible forms of capital punishment in Judaism. That's a whole other subject, why we have capital punishment, how the rabbis managed to mostly get rid of it. That if that person is hanged, they shouldn't be there all night. They should be taken down immediately because it's a curse. It's a curse against God to have somebody who's hanging there in the public square being degraded. And they go on with this parable, and they say that this is like two twin brothers who are identical to one another. One of them ruled over the whole world, and the other took to robbery, to highway robbery. After a while, this robber was caught, the twin who was the thief was caught, and he was crucified, or he was hanged. Everybody who's passing by, all the passers-by say the king is on the cross, right? Because he's the twin brother. You know, it's a twin brother. They might not recognize the twin brother. It looks like their king is hanging. Right, and for that, it's written that the person who's hanged is a curse against God. So the first thing that is incredibly astounding about this text is it says that the relationship between God and human beings is that we're twins. Right, you all got that in the parable, the king is God and the robber is some human being. We often, in texts that talk about b'tselem Elohim, sometimes it's described as human beings are the coins that are pressed out of a mold, or the human beings are somehow a reflection or an extension or a manifestation, all sorts of other words. But here, human beings are actually God's identical twin. So much so that if somebody is walking through the streets and sees that a human being is being tortured or killed, the response is, that's God up there. Right? And think about the implications of what might happen here. So in this town or this city where this king is being, people think that it's the king who's being killed, people probably go home and say, hey, our king was just executed. What does that mean? Does it mean we don't have any laws anymore? Are we going to tear down all the portraits that we have of our king? Are we throwing out all the money? Because of course the money has the king, so now our monetary system is collapsing. Maybe we're going to go out and there'll be lots of mayhem. Maybe we're going to go look for another king. Who knows what happens in the society? But the point is that because we see that this is how a human being is treated, it must be that the king, or in the Nimshals would say the explanation of the parable, that God is no longer. And this is a real challenge of Tselem Elohim, that it's not just a nice term that we throw out, but in fact that Tselem Elohim means that any injury to a human being is an injury to God. And not only that, but when we live in a world in which people are getting injured and killed all the time, and when we see it, that our natural response to be is, well, how could God possibly be existing in a world like that? That when we see this kind of injury, certainly it might make people deny the possibility of God, but also it's like God isn't quite present as much anymore because now a human being has been desecrated. And so that's a challenge for us. I don't really know what it would mean to walk through the world thinking, if I do any injury, either physical or emotional or any other injury, or if I see any injury to a Tselem Elohim, then in that moment it's as if God is directly being injured. It's as if God isn't present.
Thanks. In a way, what I want to say follows on that and maybe even plays out the implications of it. So if you look at the second source in front of you from Exodus 22, Parashat Mishpatim, I just want to look at those verses inside for 1 second. We begin with, Kol olmana v'yatom lo ta'anun. Call here in the sense not of every, but of any. Any widow or orphan you shall not oppress. Why? Because if you, here it's extremely important to notice, verse 21 was in the plural, lo ta'anun, you shall not oppress. Verse 22 proceeds into the singular, right? Ta'aneh, if you do oppress, ki imtza'o ki tz'aka elai, when they cry out to me, shamoa eshma tzakato, I will hear their cry. And then, one of the most, I think, searing verses in Chumash, v'chara api, I will be very angry, v'harakti etchem b'charev, I will kill you with the sword, v'ayu nesheichem olmanot, v'neichem yitomim, and your wives shall be widows, and your sons shall be orphans. Now, this is what I call the God who doesn't kid around. The first thing to say about this verse is obviously this is not the Torah's ideal. The Torah's ideal is not that Israel not oppress widows and orphans because otherwise God will destroy it and eat it for breakfast, right? The idea here, though, I think is actually enormously important. When you understand the Torah's logic, you find out something very important. The Torah's vision, this is especially played out in the book of Deuteronomy, but the Torah's vision is creating a society where everyone cares about one another and oppression is unimaginable. However, living as we do in a world that is imperfect, the Torah wants to create a situation where there are backup plans and guarantees. If I have to threaten you in order to ensure that a widow is not oppressed, I have no hesitation about doing that. Because much as the ideal motivation I want from you is love, compassion, and concern, more important than your inner life is the fact of the non-oppression of the widow and the orphan, right? In other words, the Torah halakha plays this out in all kinds of ways. We never wait for the doer to be fully realized as a human being in order to make sure that the recipient or the potential victim is given what he or she needs and or protected from oppression. I think it's important to understand that contextually what's going on here. Now, Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra, commenting on this verse, is bothered by why the weave of plural to singular to plural. Do not oppress, plural. If you do oppress, singular. I will punish you, plural. And Ibn Ezra says something that I honestly first stumbled upon last year, and I found it to be one of the most difficult texts I had ever read. Difficult not to understand the words, but difficult to internalize and to struggle with what it would mean to live up to it. he says the reason we move in the text back and forth between the singular and the plural is mishpat haroim ha'inui v'hecherishu ki mishpat ha'ma'aneh. Because really the judgment that awaits the one who witnessed the oppression and did nothing and literally remained silent is exactly equivalent to the judgment that awaits the one who did the oppression, him or herself. In other words, the weaving between the plural and the singular is a statement, I understand that at some level one of you is committing an act of oppression. But I want to make it clear that you're all implicated in that act of oppression. In other words, there is no such thing in biblical theology as an innocent bystander. That is the instinct to say, well, I didn't do anything. I was just sitting here minding my own business. Ibn Ezra argues that Parashat Mishpatim is trying to cut out the legs from under that kind of argument. I didn't do anything. Actually, yes, you did, because in a society in which someone is oppressed, everyone, Ibn Ezra seems to say, is at least implicated. Now, I also think it's worth noticing here that in the ancient Near East, all over the ancient Near East, the king is the person who's responsible to protect widows and orphans. The protection of widows and orphans is not a unique biblical contribution. This is a fascinating 1-second digression, but historians of the ancient Near East point out that all over the ancient Near East, the mandate not to oppress and the obligation to protect the widow and orphan is everywhere. What is totally unique to the Hebrew Bible is the extension of that to the stranger, to the ger, to the immigrant, right? Now, but here what you have is this amazing democratization of moral responsibility. It is not just the king who is responsible to protect the widow and the orphan, it is you and me. And in fact, we are implicated when the widow and the orphan are oppressed and we remain silent. Now, at the risk of saying the obvious, the reason I found this text daunting when I first read it is, first I started wondering, how do I hear this text in a way that goads me to action rather than paralysis and self-hatred? Which I think is always a challenge with texts like this, right? How do I hear this as a goad? And what would it actually mean to live up to this? And how do we actually wrestle with that? And I want to suggest one closing sentence about what that means. One of the dangers I think Jews have, anybody has, in reading ancient texts, no matter how normative we find them, is that we domesticate them by admiring them. Oh, isn't the Torah amazing? It will not allow us to oppress widows and orphans. Who's the widow and orphan in my day and age? Not sure. Don't know. But isn't it great that the Torah talks about not oppressing widows and orphans? That impulse, which is rarely that crude, but I think runs very deep. And so I think when one reads a text like this, one has an obligation to ask, what is my best sense of who the widows and the orphans in my society are? Who are the people who are vulnerable? And I want to be clear, I don't think we'll all agree on the answer, and that's okay. But at very minimum, the question is, how does a text from then speak to a political and cultural and socioeconomic situation that is now? Because otherwise, again, we just make the text sort of pretty and move on. And that's a question, personally, I find very, very hard. I'm happy to hear Rabbi Jacobs' thoughts as we go about that. But so I put that out to you as something to wrestle with as we go. And with that in mind, I'm going to shift to the dialogue part of this evening. And I want to begin by going sort of meta to the big questions. Reading Torah and Tanakh seriously, as I've just actually said, we can't help be struck by God's obsession with the fate of the vulnerable and the downtrodden. The Reverend Jim Wallace has this great story he tells about being in seminary and cutting out all the verses in his Bible that refer to the poor, and then watching the book fall apart in his hands and there be nothing left. So you can't read Tanakh without a realization of a God who's obsessed, really, with the fate of the downtrodden. It reminds me of something that many of you have heard me say many times. One of the greatest things Heschel ever said, right? Zeus loves women, but God loves widows. Incredibly powerful formulation of what the God of the Bible is really all about.
Jim Wallace used to preach with that Bible, right? The falling apart one. His line was, "This is your Bible, America." Amazing.
So Jews who lean left tend to read these sources and assume that they call for state action, right? The government is responsible to protect the welfare of those who are vulnerable and exposed. Jews who lean right, in contrast, sometimes hear this and ask whether the Torah's concern might more properly be directed at individuals. In more modern terms, we might say the nonprofit sector rather than the government. I shouldn't pay more taxes to help the homeless in New York City. They might say I should pay less and instead give the money to, I don't know, the Doe Fund or whatever the equivalent might be. So I want to ask you how we might think about this. Who's right? Is it a helpful question? And if not, why not?
Thank you. Well, I think you partially answered that by looking at this shift from singular to plural. This is an obligation when we're talking about the widow and the orphan and et cetera. This is an obligation that is both incumbent upon the individual and on the community. The modern state is obviously not the entity that they're talking about. It's not the entity that's usually talked about in halachic texts until the modern era. But one example that comes to mind for me is the example of tzedakah. So when we look at tzedakah in all of our many, many thousands of words and thousands of years of Jewish text about how we give tzedakah, to whom we give tzedakah, how we make decisions, all of these things, it's very much perceived as an individual choice. Right? Individuals give tzedakah to individuals. And not usually organizations in halachic texts. We're giving to individuals, and it's coming from individuals. And yet, we also have a system of mandating that tzedakah is given. Right? We have a system that's described in the Talmud is we have these two gabayim, these two collectors who go around and do an assessment on people. So it's not that they come and say, hey, can you put a little bit in my little pushka? They're saying, I know what your household income is and this is what you owe, and you're putting that into tzedakah for the community. That's separate from other kinds of taxes for infrastructure and building the kind of infrastructure that you need to keep a town going. And then we have a system, of course, of giving out that tzedakah to the people who it's appropriate to give it to, as well as mandates about how much tzedakah you have to give, right? At least 10%, not so much that you drive yourself into poverty. And so we have a combined system in which we have expectations for the individual, and also the state has to look out to make sure that these obligations are being met. There's an amazing suggestion that comes from Yaakov Ariel, who's the chief rabbi of Ramat Gan, in an article that he wrote, where he talks about these halachic categories, these legal categories of a chovat gavra, meaning an obligation that's incumbent upon the individual. Like tefillah, prayer would be one that just by virtue of being a Jew, I would say, that you have an obligation to pray. And another one is chovat chefsa, something that's occasioned by an object. Like, because I'm drinking a cup of tea, so I should say a blessing over it, but I don't have to drink a cup of tea. And he says that actually tzedakah is both. On the one hand, there is an individual obligation to give tzedakah. So even if there are no poor people in your town or even anywhere in the world someday, that you still have an obligation to give tzedakah. If we ever get to that point, we'll find out how that would actually work. But we each have an obligation to give tzedakah. However, that's not going to be enough. And so the state, he says, has an obligation to ensure that the people who are in need of tzedakah have what they need. Right? So there's, on the one hand, the obligation that's occasioned by you being a Jew who's obligated to give tzedakah, and the other that's occasioned by there being poor people there, that there's a state obligation, he says, to make sure that they have what they need. And those might not match up. So something he says, just skip, he says, citizens should not think themselves exempt from the mitzvah of tzedakah, for as stated, this is also an individual mitzvah, but only the community is able to do this in a widespread way. And so if it turns out that individuals giving tzedakah is actually not enough, which it never is, then in fact, and he's talking, I mean, he wrote this, I think, in the 80s, very recently, well, I guess not so recently, but in the 20th century, that the state is the one that has the obligation to make sure that people are taken care of, and that we can't depend on individual tzedakah to make that happen. So I think that the idea that you brought out from the singular and plural, that it's both. We actually need both. We need this individual obligation. We need the community or the state is deep in our text and deep in our halakha.
So in light of that, if I could compute the percentage of my tax dollars that go for the poor, does that count in my tithing?
It's a great question. I'll tell you how I do it. So I think it's extremely complicated to actually calculate that.
Probably impossible, right?
I mean, trust me, I've tried. I mean, I'm not a great economist, but I've asked some actual economists. And it's extremely complicated because if we look at the tax money, for example, that goes for Social Security, well, some of that's going to people who are poor, and some of that's going to people who aren't poor, and your Social Security is based on your lifetime earnings. So it's like extraordinarily complicated. So if there's an economist who has a formula for actually figuring out, that's great. I mean, have never been able to figure it out, neither of my economist friends. So that's one answer. The other answer is, I mean, this depends how you're getting paid, right? So for me, I'm getting paid after taxes, right? My taxes are taken off of my paycheck. So by the time it lands in my bank account, the taxes are gone. And so for me, psychologically, what I'm actually processing is the money that comes in when I'm making my budget. When my husband and I are making our household budget, it's about what's landing in our bank account. We don't really think about what went for taxes until we get to the end of the year and find out whether we owe anything or are getting anything back. And so that's just, for us, that's how we calculate, because the taxes went. They were never really ours. They never belonged to us. So let's calculate that percentage, the 10%, based on what actually lands in our bank account.
Okay. So let me shift gears for a minute and ask you a question you no doubt have been asked many times. If the critics of Rabbi Jill Jacobs were to say one thing, it would be, aren't you just cherry-picking your sources to conform to a predetermined political agenda? In other words, what work are the sources really doing besides bolstering a conclusion that's been reached in advance?
Thank you. I've never been asked that before.
Exactly, I'm sure. I love that you thanked me for that. That's great.
Well, because I know it's a friendly question. So I think one of the challenges for those of us who take seriously the work of looking at Jewish texts to find out what it actually might contribute to the world is not just looking for a few texts that sound really nice and that support what we already believe, but actually delving deep into the sources. And that means often grappling with sources that are challenging. And the sources do have, our halakha does have a perspective. So I'll give one example of where I've been criticized all across the board and think that, happen to think that I'm right about this, and that's about labor. So across the board, Jewish text halakha about labor, about particularly employers and low-income day laborers, almost always assumes that the workers are in a less privileged position, that the workers are poor, that the workers are more vulnerable, that the workers are likely to be exploited by the employers, and therefore it puts in 1,000 protections to protect the employee. And this is really across the board, and the only, might be a few exceptions, but one exception one very small exception is that there's a basic law that workers are always allowed to quit in the middle of the day. Again, we're talking about day laborers who are hired for the day, that they're always allowed to quit in the middle of the day. And the rationale for this is a verse from Leviticus where God says, Ki li b'nei Israel avadim, that the children of Israel are my servants. And the rabbis gloss this and say, v'lo avadim la'avadim. They're not servants to servants. So you should never be in a situation where it's starting to feel like servitude because you feel like you can't leave your job. And so in general, workers can walk out in the middle of the day. They've been hired to, usually it's an agricultural situation, they've been hired to work in a field. They can walk out in the middle of the day and take their pay for the morning. And the only exception is this very particular situation where let's say it's the end of the season, or for whatever reason, the harvest is going to be lost if the workers leave, and there's nobody else to be hired. So it's a very particular situation where the employer is at a disadvantage. And it's notable that this is the one small exception. So there's an absolute trend in the sources, and I might talk about this a little bit more in specifics later on, but in general, the people who try to argue the opposite, who try to argue, for example, against minimum wage or against unions, are going and trying to, there's one particular source that people choose that I'll just mention now that talks about the Minhag HaMakom, or sometimes it's called Minhag HaMedina, the custom of the land or the custom of the place that determines all sorts of working conditions. And people will say, oh, look, the market determines everything. And in fact, there are a number of sources that say, no, the market doesn't just magically determine all of these conditions. They're set by someone. And I might say more about that later. And so that's an example where there's absolutely a trend in the sources. I found actually in one particular case that I've been pushed from the left by the sources, and that's the situation of incarceration, because incarceration essentially doesn't exist in classical Jewish law other than in a couple of very particular situations, somebody who's being held in administrative detention or a few other very specific situations. And what I find is that when you get to the medieval period in particular, and incarceration starts to come in as a way that Jewish communities are responding to crime, Jewish communities that have some autonomy and are essentially taking the incarceration practices from the world around them, that the rabbis are going nuts and saying, well, wait a second, this doesn't exist in Judaism, and trying to justify it, or trying to even saying, like, 3 years is a long time for somebody to be in prison, things like this. And it was really, the first time I looked at these texts, I was really, really challenged, because of course I grew up in this country where it's just taken for granted that the major way that we deal with crime is through incarceration. And here we have this set of texts saying, well, there's only a very small number of cases where we would even use this, and wait a second, this is something coming in from the outside. How do we deal with that? So that's a place where I've been pushed from the left. And maybe I'll just stop there. We can give more examples later.
Okay, great. So one more meta question before we talk about some concrete issues in America and then eventually in Israel. If you read early religious Zionists, one of the things that is really striking is it seems totally obvious to them that the Torah's ideal economic construction of a society is socialist. Right? It's totally self-evident to them the Taurus Vision is socialistic. And yet, when you read certain contemporary Jewish religious thinkers, most but not all of them from America, they think it is totally obvious that at the very heart of the Torah's economic vision is a free market. So, how might one think about this? And is this the right question in your mind?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to this idea of Minhag HaMakom that I mentioned before. There's certainly one school of thought that says Judaism is totally socialist, and the other school, as you mentioned, that says Judaism is totally capitalist. And for the people who really believe in a sort of laissez-faire capitalism, they say, well, there's a Minhag HaMakom, which determines working conditions, pay, all sorts of things. That's mentioned in the Talmud, Bava Metzia, and then later in other places. And what I point to are other, in particular, one Talmudic text that says that, in fact, it's the Bnei Ha'ir, the people of the town, who set wages and prices and weights and other conditions. In other words, yes, it's true that whatever the custom of the place where you are is then becomes obligatory. So if the custom is you pay $7.25 an hour, then everybody has to live by it. It might be like the prevailing wage more than the minimum wage, which is legislated, or other conditions. If it's if it's the custom that people get X number of sick days, then everybody has to be obligated by that. But that custom, so as I said, the people who have directly argued against what I've written on labor will say, here, free market, the market figures it out. But in fact, the rabbis themselves weren't content to sit back and let the market figure it out. They said, let's set what it is. So we're not going to let this minhag arise from who knows where. We're going to decide what the minhag is, and then that becomes incumbent on everybody else. And the second thing that I'll say just about the balance between socialism and capitalism is, so in general, I think that the halakha supports a very controlled capitalism. We're going to allow for capitalism. There's no prohibition on getting rich, but you can't do it on the backs of other people to the point that other people are being driven deeper and deeper into poverty. One of the interesting places that it really comes out is that people who argue for Judaism being socialist always talk about Shemitah, right? So there's a remission of debts every 7 years. And yet, what I find that people often don't say is that when there's a remission of debts, it means you go down to zero. It's not like you take all the money and redistribute it. right? So it's much better to be at 0 than at negative something. But it still doesn't mean that suddenly everybody is going to be on equal terms. It means that the poor people are still going to be poor. They're just not going to be desperately in debt. So it's a little bit of it's a resetting, but it's not maybe as dramatic as some people would argue. But so I wanted to ask you, if I can turn the question back on you. I'm interested in your thoughts on both on what I said, or response to what I said, and in particular how that might relate to Zionism, to these, if you imagine these early socialist Zionists showing up in the startup nation, is that consistent with what the vision is?
Thank you. Well, yeah, so I have been trying to argue in recent years something that I'm committed to most of the time, which is that I think that the question of whether Judaism is in favor of socialism or capitalism is probably the wrong question. And that the right question is, and in some ways I think this is a harder question, how can Jewish ethics be a countercultural critic in whatever economic system it finds itself in? Right? That is to say that when Judaism finds itself in a socialist country, it might emphasize the ways that, at least under certain constructions of socialism, individuality might be insufficiently cultivated or maybe even thwarted. And when Judaism is in a capitalistic society, it might be the voice that says, wait a minute, what kind of safety net is there? Who ends up suffering under this particular political arrangement? And in other words, the question of who's right or who's wrong, what ends up happening is in those cases very often, I mean not always, but very often, Judaism ends up just basically becoming marshaled as a cheerleader for the dominant economic system, which I'm not sure is helpful in any circumstance. I think it's much more threatening and scary to insist on being countercultural in every situation. Just to give you, an example of this that is on one level not concrete, another level completely concrete. There's something about the book of Deuteronomy, Sefer Dvarim, that I think is amazing and easy to miss. Every single time Sefer Dvarim appoints someone to a role which might imply social superiority to someone else, every single time, judge, king, Levite, every time the Torah will begin using the word achicha, your brother. Sometimes the Torah will use that word to mean your brother as opposed to a non-Israelite, right? You have to appoint a king, Mikerev achicha, right? Mikerev achicha has to be one of your brothers. But also, the Torah uses it to make a different point, which is you might be under the illusion that your different socioeconomic or cultural or religious role implies that you are somehow superior or of greater metaphysical value than other people. Rest assured that that is utterly and completely false. Now the Torah does this, invokes achicha in one other place that's extremely powerful. Many scholars have argued that Deuteronomy 15, Varim Tet Vav, is in many ways the signature chapter of Deuteronomy social vision. It is the chapter about Shemitah, which in Dvarim has nothing at all to do with where my vegetables grow. In Dvarim, Shemitah is entirely about debts. And the discussion there of the obligation to achicha ha'evyon, your brother, the poor person, probably more technically, your kinsman, the poor person, your kinsperson, the poor person. There, I think subtly the Torah is doing something really moving and powerful, which is essentially responding to the temptation that very few of us would express out loud, because we would be horrified, and yet we may carry this bias in some conscious or unconscious place inside. The Torah wants to undermine the presumption that differences in socioeconomic status might actually be reflective of or might generate a difference in metaphysical status. Now again, I'm guessing if I went around the room, people would say, well, I mean, obviously. And yet, is it so obvious? Because if it was so obvious, what are the things that we currently allow to go on in our society that we would never conceivably allow to go on? If I really believe that the man sleeping in his urine down the block from here was metaphysically every bit as significant as everyone in this room, what would happen? Now, this is not a policy prescription. It's not obvious always what the exact answers are. Now, I more than many people on the left, am a real skeptic about one-to-one correspondences between biblical texts and contemporary policies. But I'm not a skeptic about ethos. And I'm not a skeptic about, I'm the opposite, about a certain set of fundamental obligations. What would happen if I took this seriously? I was telling Rabbi Jacobs yesterday about one of the strangest phone calls I've ever gotten as a rabbi. I got a call probably 3 or 4 years ago from a friend who was tutoring, she was teaching Jewish studies to a Jewish billionaire. And she called me and she said, I feel like I just failed miserably. I had the most bizarre conversation. I was talking about a Mishnah that argues for what she thought was the equality of all human beings. And he said, a progressive, social contributor to democratic causes, he said, okay, but let's be honest. My life is obviously worth more than my housekeeper's life. And she said, I was so stunned by that sentence that I sat there, and then I didn't know what to do. And what I thought was powerful about that moment was the fact that it was conscious, and he felt no inhibitions about saying it. But I suspect that some version of that thought lives in the unconscious of many of us much of the time. I suspect, to be honest, it's part of how we cope with living in a society where so many people live with basic dignities stripped away from them, or having lost those basic dignities. So as an example of what it would mean to live in a society where, the market does what it does and people suffer as they do, is actually, I think, really very powerful. And it goads us, I think, to ask the question, how might things look different? Now, about the Zionism question, I honestly find that question very hard because, to be honest, I have a rhetorical answer to that, but the philosopher in me is not sure the rhetorical answer is persuasive, right? The rhetorical answer is yes, of course. If I said to Rav Kook or Rav Moshe Victor Amiel, yes, I'd like to present you with a copy of Startup Nation. I think at best they would roll their eyes, and at worst they would say, I guess we assimilated after all. This was an enormous anxiety, by the way, among early religious Zionism. What they thought, among early religious Zionists, the fear of what they thought of as ethical assimilation will create a modern society, and it'll be like any other modern society. They thought that about violence, they thought that about economic issues. It was a kind of major anxiety. It's one of the things where if you're starting a society, American Jews in some ways have less anxiety about that because they don't have the same kind of power. On the other hand, I think the question does become, and this is a question that economists tend to be able to answer better than rabbis, but economists who are not doctrinaire, which is a caveat, which is, what is the most effective way for the fewest people to live in poverty and the greatest number of people to live with dignity? That question to me is not obvious. And this may say more about me than the issue. I'm incredibly skeptical about people to whom big questions like that are ever totally obvious. That's why I always want to move back to this notion of being countercultural. Are you sure? What about this? I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it's at least an attempt. So let's shift and talk about a little bit race in America. And I want to ask this question as open-endedly as I can. And I'll start by making myself the sacrificial goat for a minute. 8 years ago, many of us celebrated the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States with an almost giddy abandon in retrospect. On the day of Obama's inauguration, his first inauguration, I published an essay that included the following sentences. Quote, "The United States of America, the great beacon of freedom and democracy, has always been tainted by the monstrous legacy of slavery and the ways it denied that black men and women too were created in the image of God and were thus every bit as infinitely valuable as their white counterparts. Today, the same United States has sworn in its first black president, a black man who will occupy the very house that slaves built so long ago." And then this sentence that I have to say makes me blanch when I read it. "The status quo has been overturned, repudiated, one might even say redeemed." In retrospect, some would no doubt say, only a very naive white man could have written those words. The African-American thinker Michael Eric Dyson recently wrote about the ways that we've learned over the past 8 years, quote, how much animus lurked in the depths of the nation's racial subconscious, just how brutal and unforgiving the nation can be about the idea of a black man in charge. So what impact do you think the Obama presidency has had, for good and for bad, on America's struggle with race? Or to ask this question as a sixth grader might, why isn't racism over now that Obama can be president? And you have 1 minute.
Yeah, it's obviously a very complicated question that I'm sure sociologists and historians will be writing about for years and years. I don't want to forget that it actually is an amazing thing that Obama was elected. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't, when his name was first floating around, we didn't believe it, right? Nobody believed it. How could this guy, who people didn't even know how to pronounce his name, how could he possibly get elected? So I don't want to lose that. And symbols are important. I mean, I still get a little bit emotional when I see that the person who's representing the United States is a black man. That's actually kind of amazing. That said, I think that on the one hand, that some of us, I'm just saying this broadly, not putting anyone in particular in this category, but I think that there was a sentiment that not only you had, but many people had, oh, look, racism is over. And in fact, we know that's not true. We know it because there are lots and lots of systems, including policing systems, incarceration, economic systems, that continue to carry out the legacy of racism. And I think that it's easy to subscribe to the sort of great man theory of history, right? Look, a great man has been elected, and therefore we don't have to worry about everything else. And that allowed us to get a little bit too complacent. And of course, we've been woken up by the new attention to the police violence. It's been going on forever, for a long time, and yet it has been more in the public consciousness over the last couple of years. And the other impact, which we're seeing in pretty disturbing ways right now, is that in fact, many people seeing a black president over and over for 8 years allowed all of people's fear to come out. So it wasn't this sense of, wow, look how far we've moved. It's, oh my God, America is being taken away from me. Look who got the power. And all the conspiracy theories about where he was born and whether he's a Muslim and all those kind of conspiracy theories are always saying, well, he's not really one of us, right? He's not one of us because America is white. Of course, isn't true, but we want the people in power to be white because otherwise it's being taken away. And so we're seeing that come out in some incredibly ugly ways. And one of the texts I thought about when talking about this question, I feel like we can just talk about Deuteronomy 15 all night. Maybe we could have just done that. But there's this very famous paradox in this text where on the one hand, there's a promise that is made by the text, Efes ki lo yeh b'cha avyon. There's not going to be any poor people among you. Right? And at the very end of the text, it says, because the poor will never depart. We're never going to be in a situation where there's no poor. And so very famously, every commentator has to have at it about, well, how is it that there won't be any poor yet? There will be poor. The classic answer that's given by Rashi and many others following him is, well, because God says, if you follow all of my laws, there won't be any poor. That's in the text, but the comment is, God already knows that you're not going to follow all the laws. Now, I don't really like that because I don't like this idea of God saying, I'm going to give you this law about what to do, but I know that you're not going to do it. That feels a little bit mean. And so the comment that I like better is from the Ramban, Nachmanides, who says, well, in any particular generation or in any particular community, it's possible that you could eradicate poverty, but the possibility of poverty is always just below the surface. And I think that's true about race, not that for a second or a split second we eliminated racism. I absolutely don't want to say that, but we did have this moment where it felt like, oh, we're in a different place around race, maybe, and yet it's right below the surface. And so what Ramban's teaching us is actually we have to be constantly vigilant, even when it seems like on the face of it, times have changed. I'm interested, actually, before you go on to another question, I'm interested 8 years later after writing this, how would you rewrite it? What would you say?
Oh, that's a hard question. Well, one thing I would do for sure is delete that last sentence, which I just find deeply embarrassing. What I might say is I think what you just said, which is that moment was in fact spectacular and was a testament to how far America had come. And yet we live in a world that is endlessly complex, and we all learned how far America had not in fact come. By the way, as a footnote to this, I'll say, when we put on a conference last year on race in America, Professor Randall Kennedy from Harvard, he made an interesting observation, which I'm still kind of turning over in my mind, which is that it was precisely because Obama did not have the conventional African-American biography that he was electable. Kennedy suggested, I think he also talks about this in his book, Obama and the Persistence of the Color Line, that America did not elect Tyrell Jones from Detroit, and that actually is significant and requires some unpacking and some thinking through. Of course, ironically, that enabled some of the most perniciously racist tropes about the president, right? I'll just give you an example of this, which I think about a lot, right? The sort of the confusion in America between criticizing a president for his policies with which you disagree and demonizing a president as fundamentally, irreducibly, and irredeemably foreign. I've been sick a lot for the last month, which has meant I've spent a lot of time on Facebook, which made me sicker. And I read a comment by someone who had friended me recently on Facebook, who was criticizing the president for failing to go to Justice Scalia's funeral. Okay, legitimate issue to talk about. And she lambasts the president for that, and then adds the following sentence. And where did he come from anyway?
Wow.
I thought it was such an amazing sentence about, this sort of racial animus, which is no other explanation for what that really is. He can't be one of us. And I think it's going to take a very, very long time to begin to address that question, let alone healing it, because, right, a large swath of this country is in the process of propping up probably the person who spent most time and money, right? I mean, the birther movement, if it has a hero, it's Donald Trump. And so we are actually going in exactly the wrong direction in this moment rather than the right one. And I think I always tend to say something is sobering. This should not be sobering. It should be devastating and require a kind of national soul searching that I don't see any evidence at the moment we're remotely capable of. I think that's, very deep and very hard. So I think I might start the same way, but end the paragraph by saying, but let's not kid ourselves. We are at the very beginning of a very long road. And the obstacles are not merely external. The obstacles live in the subconscious and increasingly in the consciousness of many, many of our fellow Americans. Since we are running low on time, I want to ask you a question about another topic Jews talk about easily, which is Israel and the Palestinians. That was an attempt at humor, by the way. So I'm going to ask you first, to answer as briefly as you can, because I think people might be interested in hearing this. Tru'ah, the organization you run, has been engaged in an ongoing battle around transparency or lack thereof and the Jewish National Fund. You have been calling upon JNF to live up to what you call the Moses standard. So tell us about that and what that means.
First of all, I want to say Tru'ah is an organization that mobilizes rabbis in their communities to work on human rights issues, both in North America and in Israel and the occupied territories. And as rabbis and as Jews who are committed to both places, to the country where we live and to the future of Israel, we believe very strongly that there needs to be an end to the current military occupation in the West Bank. There needs to be a two-state solution. And what that means is, as American Jews, as American rabbis, that we need to take responsibility for making sure that where the money in the Jewish community is going is that it's going in places that support the future of Israel and don't continue to destroy Israel, which is what the occupation is continuing to do, to both violate the human rights of Palestinians and also, I would say, violate the human rights of Israelis and destroy hope for the future for both people. And so we, in the fall, started a campaign to ask the Jewish National Fund to publish a list of where its money goes. Jewish National Fund US collects raises about $101 million a year in the United States from Americans, sends about $20 million in grants to Israel, and we have almost no idea where that money goes. If you look at their tax forms, which I have in great length, it'll say, name of organization. For grants going out of the US, name of organization, it's blank, and then it says region, Middle East, and then it says the amount, whatever the amount is, purpose, general support. Right? So what organizations are getting that money? We know a little bit just from the organizations that are highlighted on the website. We do know that some of it is going into the West Bank. We don't know how much. And so we started a campaign based on an amazing midrash that is actually from last week's Parsha, from the end of Exodus, from Parshat Pekudei, where 2 weeks ago, where it starts, the Parsha starts, Eila Pekudei Mishkan. This is the accounting, or these are the accounts of the Mishkan. And of course the midrash asks, not directly, but it asks, well, why do you have to tell us again? We've been reading about the Mishkan for weeks. Like, why do we need another list of all the stuff that went into it? And the answer the midrash gives is it imagines that there were some people who said, well, look at Moses, he's so fat, he's, so wealthy, he must be skimming off the top. And so his response is to do a full accounting of every single bit of gold and jewelry and everything to show that, in fact, nothing was missing. And so the Moses standard is based on this idea that our beloved communal institutions, the JNF has always been perceived as apolitical. Most of us, I think, grew up putting coins in the little blue pushkas since we were 2 years old. I certainly did, to buy trees in Israel, and yet we have no idea where that money is going. Most of it is not going for trees. We don't really know where it's going. So we've been asking JNF to just put out a list of where they're sending the money.
And their response has been?
Their response has been they have not put out a list. They've said many things. They've sent out various donor prospectuses to some of our people. They've accused us of running a campaign just to fundraise, even though we are not asking for money when we ask people to take action. They've said things like, my favorite was they said, well, the green line is so named because of the trees that JNF planted, which the green line is named because somebody happened to pick up a green grease pencil when they were drawing the boundaries and went, so I don't actually even know where they got it. So they've said, well, they sent out one letter that said, we don't put any money into settlements, and then 2 paragraphs later, they started to talk about all of their history and investments in the West Bank. So it's really actually quite confusing.
Let me, in bringing this part of our conversation to a close, I want to ask you maybe we'll sort of zoom out for a minute on Israel and the Palestinians and ask the following question. You can sort of divide, kind of schematically and simplistically, people who have conversations about quote unquote Jewish values and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into those who say, well, Jewish values, that's about human rights. Judaism demands an end to the occupation. Then you have those who say, yeah, you call those Jewish values because you are assimilated Westerners. Jewish values are holding on to the land of our ancestors. Avraham Avinu is in Hebron. I'm in Hebron. What's wrong with you? And how do you suggest, as a thinker and as a leader, mediating that conversation? How do you help referee that non-discussion discussion?
Thank you. It's good to get to the easy questions at the end. The first thing that I would say is that those values are often set up as opposed to one another. And I think the question is how to actually bring them into conversation with one another. And how it is that we're going to say that there is a value, certainly, of Tzelem Elohim. There's a value of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives, right? Which the current situation is resulting in much loss of life on both sides. And it's true that we read the Torah. This goes back to the difficult text section. Yeah, we read the Torah and it talks about the conquest of the land. That's very clear, right? Torah, book of Joshua, we're talking about the conquest of the land, and we're talking about borders that are larger than what the 1967 borders would say. So how do we hold on to both of those things? And I want to say, first of all, that I think that one way to respond to that question is to say that it can be a different question what we believe religiously and what we think is politically expedient. So I think that it is possible to say, in our ideal world, we would like to have access to all of the holy sites that are in Hebron in the West Bank. And that would be an ideal. Or in an ideal world, we do believe that God gave us this land. However, because we also have a value that has to do with the value of human life, we don't actually think that our current nation, that our current state needs to be located in those places. God willing, maybe someday we'll have a peace agreement that allows Jews to go and visit Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. Right? Maybe we'll have a peace agreement that allows Jews to visit all of the various holy sites and vice versa. But it doesn't mean that the modern state has to govern those places. And I think this has been played out. This is sort of wandering into your territory, so maybe I'll let you talk more about it, but the very famous Tru'ah of Ovadia Yosef about whether you can give away land. And he ultimately says two things. One is that you can correct me on all the details, but from what I remember, he says, on the one hand, if we knew that giving away land would ultimately save lives, then we would be able to do it. And then he says, but that's totally 100% absolutely, completely impossible, right? Right, so on the one hand, he opens up that space, and then he says it's not possible. The other example I think of is Chaim David Halevi, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He died in 1998, so in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And he has an amazing tshuva that he wrote about the peace agreement with Egypt. And he says, there's this line where he says, so he's trying to figure out, can you give away land, and where are the borders of Israel, and does the state even have the right to do this, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's this amazing place where he says, I have a lot of doubt about this peace agreement. And then he says, it might be temporary, it might fail. And then he says, but it's also possible that it's going to last, and so we should cultivate it and make it grow roots. And he has lots of flowery language about that, in the possibility that there's going to be a generation that will be born into peace that won't know war, and some more language about that, which I feel like is an incredibly important religious statement and real religious leadership that I would love to see more of somebody being able to say, I really am scared of this situation. I don't know what's going to happen. Of course, who knew what was going to happen? I mean, it's lasted. It's amazing that it's been an amazing thing that peace agreement has lasted. He said, I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm completely scared, and yet I think that it's worth trying to invest in it and doing different kinds of gymnastics to make sure that it is permissible to give away that part of what was Israel to Egypt, and making sure that the state has permission to make these decisions, because he realizes that the greater good is actually more important than holding on to this little piece of land.
Let me just take a minute to thank Rabbi Jill Jacobs, really one of the...
And thank
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double Chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.